could give I guess, a hand of applause for our first speaker, Andrew. Do you have, oh, perfect. Thank you. All right.
Hey, everybody. Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be your first speaker for your first conference. I've been involved with the DevOps Days Indianapolis for a couple of years. I know how time-consuming it is and what an accomplishment it is to put an event like this together. So it looks wonderful. A little bit about me. I've been in the software industry for over 20 years. I work for some big companies doing DevOps transformations, and lately I've been working for several different startups, introducing them to SRE best practices. I'm currently at a startup called Acerto, where I'm their first SRE hire, and we're going through the whole transformation process there. Acerto is a company that we are building a authorization as a service product. So before I start, I'd like to just give you guys a refresher on the difference between authentication and authorization. That's something you may know, but it's important for this talk. Authentication is your login to your website, right? It's who you are, it's your username and password, and it presents your identity to the application. This is something you do a few times a day when you log in applications, and then you get a token, and that lasts for a period of time. Authorization is a harder problem to solve. That's what you can do once you log into the application, and that's a decision that's made several times during each page load. Every time you click a button, the application is determining whether you have access. The API behind the scenes is processing some rules. That's a much harder problem to solve, and it's an issue where latency is very crucial. So Acerto is a company that's trying to solve that with a framework. We're building a cloud-native authorization as a service piece. We're building a whole commercial stack, but today I would just like to talk about the GitOps workflow for policy as code, which we've released as an open source project that you can use right now to implement a DevOps workflow for your authorization policies. So policy as code is, you're probably familiar with infrastructure as code. That's been a trend for several years, where you put the infrastructure in a Git repository and use continuous integration to test and deploy your infrastructure. We can do the same thing with authorization policies. All the same rules apply. The same workflows can work for authorization policies, where we store policies in a version-controlled repository, just like GitHub. So we put that in the same place where you're putting your application infrastructure code. We build a version image, a container, just like a Docker container, but think of it as a policy artifact that gets pushed to a repository. And then policy changes are built, tested, and deployed in an automated workflow. And then by virtue of using these DevOps principles, we can always trace back changes to our policy to a Git commit, and it sort of meets your auditing requirements right out of the box, right? So I'm going to, because my talk ran a little long when I tested this, so I'm going to jump straight into the demo, and then we can talk about some of the things we're working on. I'm going to demo a workflow where we're using an open source engine called Open Policy Agent, which is an engine that is built into Kubernetes. It's built into applications you probably use every day, like Slack. And what it does is it evaluates policy using a domain-specific language called Rego. So Rego is a specific language that's been developed just to define policy. So if I look at a sample Rego policy here on the screen, this is looking at some Kubernetes data, and it is deciding to allow or deny my action based on some strings that it finds in the image. So I can very flexibly use this to customize the authorization, the authorization policies for what I allow to go into my cluster. So I'm going to demo this on Kubernetes today because this is a DevOps conference, right? We're going to talk about policies on our Docker files and communication and Kubernetes. But we also extend this to any aspect of an application, right? Are you an admin? Can you load this report on a Tuesday. Any flexible policy you can define in Rego code and publish using the workflows that I'm describing. So yeah, we have OPA is the engine that evaluates our policies. Rego is the language I just showed you that defines your policies. And OPCR is the Open Policy Container Registry. Think of it as Docker Hub for policies, right? It's an OCI compliant container registry that you can push policy images to. And then we're going to use GitHub Actions as our version control and CI workflow. Has anybody here heard of ConfTest? Show of hands. Cool. This will be a good demo because I just learned about this a few months ago as well. So I'm going to use ConfTest to enforce some policies on my Docker file. I have some certain images in my organization. I don't want people using unapproved Docker images when they build their applications. And I'm going to play the role of both a central security organization that defines these policies. I'm going to publish them to GitHub and use an automated workflow to push them to the OPCR registry. And then I'm going to play the role of a developer on one of the many teams in my organization that will pull this policy down from a central location and enforce it on their application. So the first thing I will show you is Open Policy Registry itself, which if you think of this as Docker Hub for policy, we can sign in and we see a list of policy repositories, just like Docker repositories that have been published here. And then attached to these repositories, I have 3 different GitHub projects here. I have a policy for ConfTest. So ConfTest is a tool that evaluates configuration files. In this instance, I'm going to be evaluating the Docker file in these projects. And I have a bit of policy here that, similar to the example I showed you earlier, enforces policy on the image name. So a little bit of Rego here that causes a denial if the from command contains a string that's on the deny list, and we'll unallow that. Any other images are implicitly allowed here. I don't have any allow rules in this, but if we happen to have OpenJDK as a image in this example, our Docker file is going to get denied when I run the workflow. And then I have another policy for a tool called Gatekeeper. Gatekeeper is actually an admission controller for Kubernetes that will run inside your Kubernetes cluster and enforce policy on objects that you create in Kubernetes. So in this case, I have a policy for Kubernetes that requires certain labels to exist on the namespaces. So in my particular organization, I have a problem with developers pushing code to the shared cluster, but I'm not sure who it belongs to. So I'd like to enforce that they tag their Kubernetes namespaces with their department name. And so we'll see that when we run through these workflows, if I don't have the correct labels on my Kubernetes namespaces, it will dynamically deny allowing that namespace to get created. So let's jump in and show you these CI workflows. The first thing I'll show you is the workflow on ConfTest. This is just a few simple steps that install the policy client, log into OPCR, the same way you'd log into Docker Hub, right? We'll do a policy login with the same syntax as Docker login, if you've all used Docker before and are familiar with that. And then the same semantics that we use for the Docker command, we're going to build our policy, build the project with those Rego files, and then we're going to push it to the policy repository, right? So every time I make a change to these policies, they'll automatically get pushed to my repository. So let's go ahead and run the workflow for this Java application. I'm calling it Demo App. It's just a boilerplate Hello World Java application that should start up and run when we deploy it. It has a Kubernetes namespace called demo app, and we have a deployment here, which just deploys a single replica of this image. So if we jump into GitHub Actions and just kick off this workflow, right? Go ahead and pretend that my developer just made a commit. This workflow is going to start up and run. And so far, the live demo at the first Birmingham DevOps Days conference is working. So we can see we went through that step where we logged into OPCR, we checked our policy signature, and we pulled the policy Docker, or the equivalent to a Docker image, the policy artifact, right? And now we're running our tests on the Docker file. And we got a failure, which is what we expected, right? And our failure is, oh no, unallowed image found, OpenJDK 17 Alpine, right? So in this case, our developer has violated our policy and will not be allowed to deploy until they correct that. So let's, instead of making the developer correct this, let's actually throw them a bone and change the policy. So I'm just going to change my deny list, and I'm going to allow them to use OpenJDK, right? And so I will go into project here, and I will make a commit to change policy to allow OpenJDK. And here's my audit trail, right? Push that. And if this goes well, you should see the policy CLI in action, building the policy and pushing it and signing it. And that worked. So if we go back and rerun this workflow, with any luck, we will get past that policy block. Test policy, test passed, everything's green, and now we're building. So this is what we expected. And then our next step is actually deploy. So this will kick off right after Docker finishes pushing here. This will kick off CD. And we'll see what happens there. Logging into OPCR, checking the signature, pulling the policy, reaching out to Kubernetes to deploy the application, and oh no, we have an error creating the namespace. We're not allowed to deploy namespace without a department, right? So let's once again go in here and fix that. Add a label for the department to the application. This time the developer is going to try to bring their application into compliance with our policy. And I will cd into demo app. Add labels. And when we go through and build this, everything goes correctly. This should actually deploy correctly. So let's go back and talk about some of the tools we were using. I'll just do a review of OPA was Open Policy Agent. This, like I said, is the engine that evaluates Rego code. This is a library and a daemon that you can embed into any piece of software, and we're seeing it in more commercial pieces of software these days. And it's the engine behind Kubernetes policy. We used Rego as the language to define our policies. It's a very flexible language specifically built for policy. We used OPCR, which our logo is in a cute little axolotl salamander, by the way, OPCR is the Open Policy Container Registry that we pushed our image to. And we linked this all together with GitHub Actions and successfully deployed to Kubernetes. So that is it for the demo. Happy to answer any questions if we have time. Or
You can answer.
Sure.
Anybody have any questions for Andrew? Gotta get the
Yes, sir.
Testing. All right, awesome. Cool.
Thanks for a great talk and the demo. What part of all of this is any of this Asserto, or is this all open source tooling?
Asserto is all the enterprise features you would want on top of this, like a fancy control panel and audit logs and a managed service. OPCR is open source. The policy CLI is open source. You can go do everything that I'm doing here, open source.
Anybody else? Let me run over here, sorry. Whoops. Oh. Someone didn't think this through.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious if you have any experience self-hosting the OPCR registry, and if so, can you share any thoughts on that?
This is a OCI compliant registry, so any Docker registry will work. OPCR is just an instance of, so I haven't tested every registry, but I imagine you could use Amazon's or Google's, or you can push these images to anything that supports that API. So yeah, you can host it anywhere you like.
All right, anybody else? Cool, well, thank you, Andrew, so much. Not only the first talk of DevOps Days Birmingham, but also a working demo on a Monday morning. The guys are smiling on us today, thank you.